Oh, good. I like raisin
chocolate chip.
If I could just have your attention, I'm not going to give any main introduction except to say this is Tim Brown and Helen Taylor, who are also volunteer mediators. So the different training groups, you all don't get to intermix that much. So everyone here is a CCR volunteers. So I'm just going to hand it over to them and let them do their program on mediation and their work at clean sites and environmental disputes. And feel free to just please get up and get what you need during the session. And I know some of you may have to leave a little bit earlier, but hopefully we could also have some discussion as well. I'd like to keep it pretty informal, so if you have questions, make sure we can bring those up. So I'll hand it over to them, Tim and Helen.
Well, hello everybody. Maybe we could start by just finding out who all of you are. Just be curious as to what organization you're with. Or I guess everyone here mediates at either at the Daily Center or here, but it would just be interesting to find out who everyone is.
My name's Dave Brewer. I journeyed from DeKalb.
Oh my gosh. Good for you. I'm
It's
yeah.
kind of fun.
Yeah.
I work with an agency called PAX, the Illinois Institute for Parents and Children, and I primarily do divorce and
I'm Dale Turner. I'm with the Commissioner of Bank as their Assistant General Counsel. And in another life, I was an environmental prosecutor, so I'm just interested to see what's happening.
I'm Mark Ferguson. I just began at CCR as John Weiss's administrative assistant, and I have a history of volunteering for groups like Greenpeace, and so I thought this would be quite interesting for me.
I'm Brad Ginn, and I'm a business, community, and family mediator. So I have my own private practice, and I'm a volunteer here.
I'm Gary Groley, in solo law practice, and I do mediation with CCR and through the court system, mandatory arbitrations and arbitration with BBB.
I'm Fritz Crandall. I'm environmental attorney at Ship Hardman Wade, and actually I'm a guest of a mediator here with CCR, but I've participated in several environmental mediation.
I'm Michael Nathanson. I'm a volunteer here. I do business consulting and some teaching, but for about 7 years back in the dark ages, I worked in environmental stuff, hydroelectric plants, special nuclear material, nuclear plants, coal plants, national policy.
I'm John Lamont. I'm a mediator with the Center and also a city planner by trade. I'm the senior principal of a new firm that was founded a year ago in planning and development design. And prior to that was planning for a couple large architectural firms. Worked with the city of Chicago and here still as a planner.
My name is Janet Walker. I'm a graduate student at the University of Chicago. And I also teach there occasionally, and right now I'm working on a project in peer mediation and conflict resolution at Chicago Public.
My name is Lee Joe. I'm a private civil mediator with my own company, Mediated Settlement Service.
I'm Tim Brown, and I'm the manager of the Midwest Regional Office for Clean Sites. And
I'm Helen Taylor, and I'm a senior analyst and mediator in Clean Sites Chicago office.
And what we wanted to do today was just to give you an overview of, first of all, our organization and how we kind of got involved in this, and also to describe how different ways in which mediation is being used, or a third-party neutral is being used in environmental disputes. I think that, well, just to begin with, Clean Sites is a nationwide organization. We're headquartered in the Washington, D.C. area. We're a nonprofit organization, and we have different sections to the organization. We primarily focus on hazardous waste and pollution-oriented projects, and we get involved in that area in 3 different ways. The organization was formed in 1984 by a coalition of environmentalists, industry people, primarily the chemical industry, and government representatives. And the idea was to establish a neutral organization that could help address some of the roadblocks within the Superfund program to getting towards cleanup. Are people familiar with the Superfund program? By and large, okay. The Superfund program is run by EPA, and it's the very large federal program that investigates and cleans up hazardous waste sites. And there's a large role for what they call potentially responsible parties, or responsible parties that have some obligation or liability toward cleanup. And the idea for the organization really came about to address issues related to that community, to what the potentially responsible party community. And the idea was to establish an organization that could address some of the cost allocation kinds of issues, technical issues, as well as some policy issues. So those are the three areas that the organization focuses on. In policy, we look at ways to improve the process for addressing hazardous waste issues on a federal level as well as on a state level. And we do that by trying to convene what we call stakeholders. These would be different parties that have a role or a stake in the whole Superfund or hazardous waste question, and try to reach consensus on ways to improve some of these government programs through a stakeholder participation kind of process. We also work on technical issues as a third party. In many cases, if there are several responsible parties, those people who may have contributed to waste to the site or own the site or what have you, there may be a need to have a third-party technical entity to assist in trying to understand what some of the technical issues are and to try to resolve any technical disputes. And then we have our settlement services area and our alternative dispute resolution area, which has by and large focused on cost allocation, mediating cost allocation projects. And what that means is as a third-party neutral, trying to work with anywhere from 200 to 600 responsible parties to try to develop an equitable and fair allocation of costs for cleanup. And those have been the real mainstays of clean sites. We are funded as a nonprofit organization by grants from foundations, by donations from companies and individuals, through government grants and cooperative agreements, and by fee for service. So some of our services, particularly in the technical area and in the mediation area, could be received via contract as opposed to a grant. So that's kind of how the organization is funded. A couple years ago, we opened the Midwest Regional Office, which consisted of one person. And the idea was to try to see what opportunities there were for an organization like ours in addressing environmental issues out here in the Midwest. And the concentration that we have had out here has not been on cost allocation, although Clean Sites does do mediation in the Midwest on cost allocation and Superfund projects. That has not been the focus of what we've been doing out here. And I think that's been kind of an interesting discovery, because what we found in a very short period of time is that there is a real strong role for third-party neutral in the use of mediation in a variety of environmental issues beyond just Superfund, beyond just cost allocation. What we wanted to do was to illustrate two of those. I'm going to talk about one having to do with a voluntary cleanup project, and Helen's going to talk about a facilitation project involving government entities. And let me just say, please feel free to raise your hand and ask questions. And I'm often told that our organization is hard to understand at first explanation, so if you're confused or if you need me to explain anything, please just fire away. The focus that we've ended up having out here in the Midwest has been a lot on Great Lakes issues, and looking to see how it is that a third-party neutral can be useful in trying to move along some projects in the Great Lakes. And I have a background in Great Lakes issues, so it's also been a particular interest of mine. One project that we got involved in, and it involves what they call an area of concern in the Great Lakes. These are designated areas that are particularly toxic, that are contributing quite a bit to the loadings in the Great Lakes, and they are of prime interest to the U.S. government and the Canadian government, and they are identified by both governments as requiring action. U.S. EPA, who we do a lot of work with, has organized itself to try to bring its regulatory might to bear on some of these areas of concern. And the way EPA is organized is like a bunch of fingers. You know, it's got the water division that focuses on water issues. It has the air division, which focuses on air issues, and the waste division, which focuses on waste and blah, blah, blah. But it rarely kind of operates like a hand. You know, it rarely coordinates those activities. So what EPA decided to do is to give it a whirl in some of these areas of concern by getting together what they call multimedia cases, trying to use their enforcement authority under different laws to try to get at air issues and water issues and waste issues sort of simultaneously. And they've really done that in Northwest Indiana, and they are starting to do it in Southeast Michigan. I'm going to talk a little bit about Northwest Indiana, and Helen will talk about Southeast Michigan. So we were aware that EPA was doing this, that they were working quite a bit in using a very heavy enforcement approach to getting environmental gains in this area. So we recommended that perhaps they'd want to try an alternative approach to that, because the enforcement approach is very contentious. It's expensive. It takes a long time before you get an environmental benefit, and it seemed like that there would be an opportunity to demonstrate how a mediated approach could get to the same goal faster, cheaper, and with the cooperation of parties. EPA was interested in the idea and asked us to work in the Grand Calumet River. How many of you have ever been to Gary, East Chicago area, Northwest Indiana? Okay, how many of you have stopped by there and poked around? And yeah, well, good. It's an interesting area. The Grand Calumet River flows into Lake Michigan through the Indiana Harbor Canal. There's a lot of contamination that comes out of there, and that is what is the area of concern. The reason why there's a lot of contamination is because of the 100 years of industrial activity that's gone on there. There's one very major refinery there right now in Whiting, Indiana, owned by Amoco Oil Company, but there were several other refineries that were active there. And as it turns out, there has been concern in that area regarding petroleum product that's getting into the surface water and then going into Lake Michigan. And that's something that the EPA was very interested in stopping. But because of the way that the laws are written, there was no clear way that they could use an enforcement approach to get at the problem, although the state of Indiana has some ability to that. So they were interested in an alternative way of trying to coalesce several different landowners along the Grand Calumet River and to see whether or not these people would be interested in a voluntary cooperative way putting in various technical measures in order to prevent this petroleum from getting into the surface water. So that was the project. The project was to do a convening study, as a third-party neutral, to go out and interview confidential individual interviews with several landowners along the Grand Calumet to determine the circumstances under which they would participate in a voluntary, what we're going to call source control project. In other words, they were being asked to control petroleum that may be on their properties from getting into the surface water. EPA was not interested in cleanup. The environmental goal here was just to prevent continued contamination of the waterway. So we developed an approach that is a very typical mediated approach, in that we went through a series of individual interviews to try to figure out whether people would do this. And As it turns out, the landowners were very skeptical and figured out that there was really no reason that they wanted to do this, and thank you very much for coming, but no thanks. However, after talking it through, no one wanted to be excluded if there was ever going to be a meeting about this. So the individual interviews occurred, and we did them with the landowners. We also did them with the state of Indiana and with US EPA. And the idea was just to determine would conditions ever be right for this. And we never really knew right off the bat, but we realized that there was at least some interest in having a conversation about it. So we did our convening study, and we issued a report on that, which recommended that the parties get together, which we then moved to that phase of getting the private landowners, EPA, and the state together, which was a remarkably awkward meeting. For one thing, that these landowners, although you sort of lump them together as landowners, didn't know each other at all, even though they had their businesses right next door. And we were only dealing with the plant managers. We were not dealing with council. No attorneys were involved in the initial stages. So we were asking these technical people to kind of, come by and talk about this. We also had the state and US EPA that had some, not necessarily an agreement. They did not have an agreement about this whole project. And then, of course, we had the private parties with the regulators, which was confusing for them, yeah.
Were you suggesting you involve the tech people first, or that's just not working out?
We suggested working through the plant managers because the issue that we were talking about is a technical issue at the moment. We were uncertain at that point what this was going to lead to. We didn't know whether we were going to be shooting for some agreement where attorneys would have to be involved, or whether we were just going to have one meeting and that would be it. And plus, those are the people that are right there at the site. If there is going to be a discussion on technical issues, the attorneys are probably bringing anyway, so it just seemed easier to work that way. So at any rate, we started off these meetings and had to do quite a bit of caucusing. We structured the meetings so that we provided for the parties, the private parties just to speak among themselves, for the regulators to go off and speak among themselves, to bring it back. It was a very, it was an agenda kind of like an accordion, and they were bringing people back and forth and back and forth. But what it served to do was to get everybody to know each other, to get everyone at the table so that they could see that they had something in common with each other, particularly the private parties. And in our caucuses with the private parties, we really focused on why would you ever want to do this? I mean, let's not do it if you don't want to. So let's put up pros and cons. Let's really go through this and see, is this worth it? Under what conditions would it be worth it? And as it always started out, people had many more reasons why they shouldn't do it than why they should. What we were asking them to do was to voluntarily spend money before they were obliged to by any regulatory program. But as it turned out, the more we sort of talked about it, even though the list was longer on the con sides, on the pro sides were just some very big issues. Yeah.
The phrase you just used, what we were asking them to do was spend money. It sounds like you weren't really acting as neutral at that point.
I should say that that would have been one of the inevitable outcomes of the project. We were not asking them to spend money, but it was clear to everybody that if they were to do a voluntary action, that's what would be required. We were not advocating that they spend money. In fact, we were always made sure that we allowed this thing to stop at any minute. In fact, it was strange to be in the meetings because when they started, I had no idea how it was going to end up and whether or not we were going to get to a second meeting or a third meeting. It just was one little tiny step after.
You think you were perceived as neutral by various parties?
Yeah, and we went to some length to establish that. Our arrangement, we were being funded by EPA, but we've had some contingencies on that funding that would provide for our neutrality, and we communicated that pretty clearly to the parties. In our convening meetings, we met with them individually. We did summaries of those meetings, which we sent back to those parties to review before we distributed it to anybody else. Before we combined them and distributed it to anyone else, we also allowed them to strike anything from those summaries that they felt was confidential. And the process of the caucusing really helped establish neutrality as well, because we were perfectly willing to ask people who were funding this, EPA and the state, to leave the room. And in fact, in one meeting we had EPA and the state leave the room for 4 hours, and they were furious at the end of that because they figured it was a waste of their time to come down. But nonetheless, it was very important to us to really focus on whether or not these private parties were going to be able to go forward with this.
Could you expand either now or later on that question? I don't quite understand. If you are frequently paid by EPA, then how, over a long period of time, do you avoid not being EPA's firm at all? I mean, at all.
Well, I think that, well, first of all, we don't do consulting work. The kind of work that we get paid to do is to be the third-party neutral. So none of our work do we represent, do we advocate the agency's position.
No, I mean, in any series of this sort of thing over a long period of time, if you do something that totally turns off a local landowner, that at least permits you to get future contracts from other landowners in Utah or wherever. But if you turn off EPA, then that cuts out a major source of funding, period.
Well, we have turned off EPA. Actually, when we established this office, that was one of the first things that happened, is we turned off EPA through a completely different project and even a different state and whatnot. But I think one of the things about EPA is that in their headquarters office, they have a section on alternative dispute resolution, and they have been very aggressive about funding a whole series of dispute resolution consultants to do this kind of work. So as an agency, their culture is changing such that they are appreciative of the role that third-party neutral plays. I think one thing that I've learned in being in this job and doing it is learning what it's like to be neutral, which I think it doesn't, for me, it's not necessarily come easily, in that it's, you do set yourself up for being attacked by everybody. Yeah.
Well, I'm a little unclear unless Mr. Wallace out of the room. If you're being paid to come in as a mediation consultant, when we mediate, we're telling people we're the neutral, objective third party. You're going to make the decision, we're going to help facilitate the process. So are you being paid to be the facilitator, mediator, and then the process evolves that, so they're not paying you to advocate, close the dump, open the dump, pay now, pay later. You're working it through the disputes.
Right.
Okay. So if EPA says, we got a crisis, we can't solve it, we want to hire you to come in and resolve it, or Dow Chemical or Amoco hires you, it's the same thing.
Right.
So your service is strictly facilitation, mediation, you're not arbitrating, you're not saying it will be a $5,000 settlement versus $10,000.
We do arbitration as well, and in some of those cases there's a cost sharing component in our financial arrangement. So for example, if we have on a cost allocation project, which is separate from the case I'm describing here, but in a cost allocation project, we would get some seed money probably from EPA through a contract with a nonprofit organization called Resolve, which is affiliated with the World Wildlife Fund. And we would use that as the funds to do a convening type of project around. If the project goes forward, then there is a match that must get paid by the other parties involved.
So sometimes up front they will say, we want you to do this kind of a situation, not mediate, but actually arbitrate and get money involved.
Right.
So you know that going in now.
Yes, yes, and in some cases we're hired as both. In some cases we're hired as, in some of the cost allocation ones, we're hired as a mediator, but if the mediation fails, then our contract provides us to be an arbitrator. And in some cases, within the state of Michigan, we have an arrangement where that's all we do is arbitration. So, I mean, and it's in those cases too when we're working with private parties who show up a lot. And you've probably seen this in your law practice, that you tend to see the same people all the time, and there's sort of an interview process that goes on for mediators. And sometimes a private party is there who may feel they got burned the last time that Clean Sites was used, so therefore they don't want Clean Sites involved. And you certainly run that risk in trying to come up with I mean, when you think about in cost allocation with the cleanup, someone's going to have to pay. I mean, that's what it's about. There's a lot that goes into trying to figure out the criteria to determine who pays how much, but someone's going to pay, and someone's going to pay more than somebody else. And there's always some tension and difficulty around that.
I can interject one comment, because I think the question is interesting about neutrality, is that there is one angle for me that maybe we could be perceived not as neutral, and that is the fact that we're an environmental organization with a mission statement to protect the environment. So that is an advocacy-based sort of nature to the organization. So I can see where that might be perceived as, yes, we do have certain things we want to accomplish, and but I think the way you're answering the question is accurate. I mean, we're always a neutral, but we are there to protect the
And you've
environment.
had corporations hire you to do the same. And if the corporation wants to expand their plants or something, runs into a community group that's just hot against it, they can hire you to come in and do it if the group agrees to it.
We haven't been involved in, we have worked on some community issues related to a private project, but we haven't been involved at this point to mediate a dispute like that on the private side. I mean, we've worked some on the public side, and we've worked some with community by invitation of a community group, but not the other way.
The process we always follow is fair, is open, is neutral, but there is that underlying current fact that we are an organization.
Would that mean, for example, that let's say the EPA is sitting down with somebody who is supposed to be polluting some, well, for example, that you're giving, and that when it comes to looking at the technical standards, that you are more likely to go with EPA standards, that is, in your own recommendations?
Well, as far as standards go, the standards are set by the regulations. So unless it's some kind of a voluntary arrangement outside of a regulatory program, standards aren't really negotiable.
No, that's not what I mean. I mean, there's a substantial body of scientific knowledge which says that many EPA standards are just totally incorrect. So when those standards that independent scientists say are incorrect are brought to bear at the table, when you're looking at EPA standards, water quality, air quality, impact on death rate, all of those.
The question is, do we go with EPA?
Right. I mean, is your view, well, it doesn't matter if you, the local guy, thinks that these standards don't matter, if that's okay, we'll talk about that, or?
Well, actually, when I mentioned that we got into hot water with EPA, actually that was the issue, and that we were asked as a third-party neutral to review a process with involving a Superfund site in Ohio, and the idea was to try to look at there's a major conflict in this community regarding technical issues, which I think are one of the most difficult kinds of conflicts to deal with. But there was the community experts versus the EPA experts, and they were arguing about radiation and whether or not radiation was a problem at the site or not. And we were asked to come in and take a look at that and see, well, how is it that we got to this point? The question wasn't, are you, do you agree? We weren't asked to agree on one side or another. We weren't asked to sort of say, well, yes, we agree with the community group or EPA on this. We were really trying to figure out why is it that this conflict is occurring. And what we did is we came out with a statement, a report that criticized EPA significantly and referred the technical case over to the Science Advisory Board, which I just met with somebody the other day that said that's still going on. This was a project that we were involved in 2 years ago.
Well, in that case, you weren't asked to provide any technical expertise like death rates and radiation rates and like an environmental consultant. You were really strictly looking at the process,
Trying to figure out what went wrong.
breakdown,
Yeah.
and the mediation side.
Yeah. Although we have been involved in technical mediations and arbitrations, we do that a lot in the state of Michigan, where we are asked to, we do receive technical information, give arguments.
So that I think that's what I'm trying to ask. So that if in those situations you consistently came down on the side which said that EPA standards, when they differ from the general scientific community, are not the ones that you would go with. Side and scientist side, so to speak. If I can make, I know it's not a strict dichotomy, but if I can make it just for the sake of asking,
So the EPA consistently got the impression that whenever these technical issues came up, you were always taking the side of those folks who are outside of EPA. Might that affect how EPA treats you? Or do you consistently take a side position? Do you normally go with the EPA standard? Do you normally...
The word that's confusing that you're using is